gonna be. Give it up, it's gonna be alright.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Trans Stupid, where I look over some of the news that's been going on over the last week, not just for trans issues, but generally the whole LGBTQIA+++ spectrum, because stupidity is intersectional. So the first topic I want to touch on today has become a much bigger issue than I first predicted. A couple of weeks ago, I touched upon Martina Navratilova, the former tennis champion who had spoken out against trans women competing in sports with normal women. Now, at the time, she received quite a widespread condemnation from LGBT activists, despite her open support of LGBT rights. What we've seen in the past few weeks, however, has shown there really is another side to this debate that does need to be listened to. We've actually seen several prominent athletes, including Paula Radcliffe and Sharon Davies, the former British swimmer. Speaking to the BBC, Sharon Davies said that many athletes are actually feeling the same way as Navratilova, saying it is not a transphobic thing. I really want to say we have no issue with people who are transgender. Every single woman athlete I've spoke to, and I've spoken to many, all of my friends in international sports understand and feel the same way as me. Unfortunately, a lot of people who are in the races now are in a very difficult predicament where they can't speak out. It maybe falls to the people who are competing in the past who would be able to understand the predicament that is being faced at the moment to try and create a debate and try to explain how we feel there needs to be a fair and level playing field. We need to come up with something that works for everybody and everybody agrees with, rather than having all sorts of diverse rules. We need to come up with a unified set of rules that is clear, concise and fair. I believe there is a fundamental difference between the binary sex you're born with and the gender you may identify as. To protect women's sports, those with a male sex advantage should not be able to compete in women's sport. Now, as I've mentioned previously, I don't know the full science of whether a trans woman should be able to compete against a normal woman. It isn't something which I could claim to be an expert on, but there is a clear conversation that needs to be had. Likes of Navratilova and Davies are not lone voices in this. There are many, many people who feel as though trans women should not be competing with normal women. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that sometimes trans women may have an advantage. We've seen various trans athletes excelling in certain sports when it looks like they've not really taken much in the way of hormones. Some trans athletes out there clearly look as though they have some sort of advantage. Just look at these photos. How can you honestly say that this person who has not been born a woman is competing at the same level as the people playing around her? This simply isn't fair. They're too big to be able to play against them. Now, I can understand an argument somewhat if people have been taking hormones for a very long period of time. Hormones do change your body. Now, do they change your body enough so that gets rid of any of the sporting advantage testosterone would give you? That is what the real argument on this should be. If we're going to have it as anyone can self-identify to get into a sport, you've immediately broken the sport. Now, I have friends who previously played in roller derby, and they would explain to me how they would have two, it sounded like there was two leagues. Effectively, you'd have the men's league, and then you would have the women's and NB league, which is everyone except for cis men. So if a guy wants to enter that one, all he needs to do is say, I am now magic gender, I am now a trans woman, I am now the moon. And by those rules, that person can now play. And they're going to be much bigger than everyone else. It seems like the women's league is the one that disappears. And this is always the way. In fact, whenever you look at how non-binary, gender-neutral terms are always put in, it's always the women's space which is lost. It's never the men's space. Now, there are generally a couple of reasons for that. I think a lot of it is to do with a lot of MBs being biologically women. I think that's quite a big proponent in this. I don't think it's fueled on the hatred of women, but that doesn't mean that women don't lose out. In fact, that's pretty much what always happens. And it's this self-ID which is the real problem here. And just to prove a point, the other week a rapper by the name of Zuby broke a woman's weightlifting record without even trying because, whilst he was doing it, he identified as a woman. And this is what self-ID allows people to do. You can just say you are this and that's it, and you don't have to take any action. So what's the best way forward when it comes to trans women being in sports? Should it be an absolute blanket ban? Probably not, but it shouldn't be based on whether this person feels like they're a woman or not. It should be based on, are they going to be competing at the same level as the other athletes? I've always been against self-ID. In fact, my very first video touches on how self-ID is a very bad idea, and it should be the same way in sports. But I think that this in particular is going to be quite a big turning point. Look at the amount of big names that are coming out in support of Navratilova, and then compare that to the people who are coming out in support of trans athletes, which mostly seems to be other trans women. It's not like they have a vested interest in this or anything, is it? And then we have Rachel McKinnon, and yet she's being put forward as the authority. I'm actually really glad Navratilova made her comments now. This is going to start a much healthier discussion. And this conversation on sport is really bringing to the forefront how toxic this whole trans debate can be, with Sky News even noticing that a lot of this is just turning into hate. And that's not hate for trans women, by the way. That's hate for anyone who dares to voice an opinion that goes against the trans narrative. And that's exactly what this is, a narrative. This is forcing a narrative down people's necks. The people who are criticising it don't necessarily hate trans women. And in fact, there's some moments where you can tell that this narrative is really changing. For example, Plymouth Live wrote an article on how Sharon Davies is taking down trolls. Now, normally this kind of thing will be wrote the other way around to try and be as woke a take as possible. But no, this is actually celebrating someone taking down trans activists. That's quite unique in the woke media of current year. Now, it wouldn't be a Rose of Dawn video if I didn't touch on what's become one of my specialist subjects, and that's the National Union of Students, who this week held their LGBT plus conference. This follows their trans conference, which they held at the end of January, despite the NUS making moves to completely defund that campaign. Now, I've talked a lot in the past of how the NUS has quite a hard left radical agenda behind it. You can see this from some of the people who have been elected into various positions. For example, everyone's favourite flashing officer Jess Bradley has been a noted communist, and Rob Noon, who has now been elected the LGBT officer, once said that communism is politicised kindness. So why am I bringing this up again? Well, I wanted to touch upon one of the motions which I think has gone unnoticed by quite a lot of people. Motions for previous campaigns, and particularly in the trans campaign, have focused a lot on anti-fascism action, despite this not really having anything to do with being LGBT. They never define what fascism is. They just say that they want to fight it. And predictably, the LGBT motions include this with an added provision to a particular group. Guess who they are? Go on, you'll never guess. That's right. So TERFs are also included as being fascists. According to Motion 202, Bash Back. Nice bit of violent imagery there, guys. Conference believes transphobia and transmisogyny has been spouted from all angles, from anti-trans demonstrators at a London Pride parade to editorials and op-eds in liberal news publications. TERFs are becoming increasingly confident and are adopting tactics used by fascists and nationalists, such as doxing, joining with the religious right, and stirring up the demonisation of trans people on the street. An explicitly radical and queer student response to both fascism and TERF ideology in the UK is urgently needed. This response and its critique of TERF ideology must go beyond rhetoric around an individual's feelings. It must effectively tear apart biological essentialism rooted in colonialist ideology and provide a material analysis of the far right's transphobia and transmisogyny. Just to pause for a second, they're saying that biological fact is rooted in colonialism. I get that a big part of the left's rhetoric at the moment is saying that they need to decolonise everything because whitey's influence is too much. Biological essentialism, as they put it, is actually very important. Because I'm biologically male, I needed to be treated for gender dysphoria. This is not something that needs to be got rid of. To be blunt, we must not be afraid to call a spade a spade. When we see TERFs using fascist tactics like masking up. We should not stay away from highlighting these similarities and the similar ways in which TERFs and fascists want to socially engineer trans people out of public life. The conference also resolved to not share a platform with anti-trans individuals or groups who are associated with groups who used fascist tactics. Now, a big problem with this, and generally anti-fascist movements in general, is they never define what fascism is, leaving it completely open to interpretation. People who are centrist, maybe a little bit right-wing, some even a bit left-wing, have been wrongly accused of being fascists in the past, and therefore it's fair game to attack these people in every way they see fit. Whether it's physically assaulting them in the street, or whether it's removing any kind of chance that this person could have of leading a normal life and getting a new job, being able to move forward, because they will target them as much as they can. And it's a similar problem here by using the word TERF. They've not described what TERF means. It's supposed to mean trans-exclusionary radical feminist, but a lot of people who are being labelled as TERFs do not fit that definition, such as myself. I am not trans-exclusionary nor a radical feminist. The term is practically a slur, and it's almost meaningless when it just means anyone who disagrees with you. Along with the usual fluff, such as another motion sticking it to Brazilian President Bolsonaro. Like, you guys really are not going to make a difference there, I'm sorry to put it to you. They also have a motion standing up for trans healthcare. They've been telling us over the past couple of months just how important it is to have an exclusive trans campaign, despite the fact that the last one died on its arse after Bradders was suspended. And yet here, we have big motions, one of the wordiest motions in the whole document, mind you, being there just to support trans health, and in particular action for trans health. So do you really need your own campaign, particularly when you have someone like Rob Noon, who, to be fair on him, actually seemed to have picked up a bit of the slack of the old campaign last year? The NUS is in a dire financial situation right now. They could realistically be going bankrupt in a matter of months. You've seen that they've been defunding things. In fact, they've even made a big move to completely defund all the other liberation campaigns and just have one liberation officer, which some activists weren't happy about, in case that meant a straight, white, het, cis woman became the officer. How dare. Moving on the 8th of March, it was the International Women's Day. Now, normally I don't really pay attention to days like this, although if people want to be able to mark it in whatever way they see fit, they're more than welcome to do so. But a lot of trans activists decided that they wanted to mark it as well. And one of the ways that they decided to do this was with a nice, peaceful, friendly march onto the Ministry of Justice. So yeah, nothing is more welcoming than a group of masked individuals shouting and screaming with coloured smoke coming out of them. The Twitter user who filmed that footage said he wasn't really sure what they were protesting about, saying they did try to go into reception, shout a bit, jump around a bit, then stood outside with smoke grenades before being moved on. All highly effective, as none of us understood what they were on about. So they were protesting a recent move to house trans women in a specific trans wing in prisons. Some trans activists have claimed that this is kind of like segregating trans women from normal women, as so they're saying that we are a lesser kind of person. And unsurprisingly, Jess Bradley's organisation Books Beyond Bars was also not happy about this. But these weren't the only activists to take advantage of it being International Women's Day. We saw a protest in Australia where we had some quite vicious signs being held up by people and some nasty slogans on t-shirts as well. These general international women's movements, they're very much intersectional, and them being intersectional means that trans activists have to get a seat at the table as well. So we're going to be seeing this thing more and more and more. But I, for one, am getting very sick of seeing trans activists acting in this way. What happens to a peaceful protest where you're not threatening to beat people up if they disagree with you, or use their graves as toilets? Here's a bit of a tip for the next time you guys decide to protest though. Don't cover yourselves up like Antifa. Don't use smoke grenades like Antifa. Don't barge into buildings and jump around and act like children like Antifa. Basically, just don't be Antifa. Now I want you to keep these images of those protesters in your head for this next section, because it might make it a little bit more entertaining. Now it's fair to say one of the most controversial trans activists out there is Munroe Bergdorf. Now, for those who might have forgotten, Munroe became famous back in 2017 after she made some quite interesting comments concerning white people. So yeah, those comments went down the storm, as you can imagine, and the L'Oreal eventually removed her. Despite that, she's been a relatively prominent activist, but I can't imagine if the races in her rants were reversed, such a person would be able to stay in the public eye. Despite coming from a wealthy background, Munroe has managed to perfect the victim narrative. And the latest group to be put at fault for a painful existence is the toxic media. Munroe Bergdorf blames toxic media for making trans women feel unsafe. Transgender model Munroe Bergdorf has criticised the toxic media climate for making trans women feel under threat. The 31-year-old delivered a speech at the Women of the World Festival at South Bank Centre in London over the weekend. During her speech, she discussed the British press claiming that it is making trans people, including herself, feel unsafe in public spaces. It is really sad. This is my 3rd year speaking at WOW, and it's always been a really sacred space for me. Unfortunately, this is the first year that I felt a sense of dread coming. It isn't anything to do with the organisation. Unfortunately, it's to do with the increasingly hateful narrative that trans women are a threat to cisgender women, and there's absolutely no statistics to show this is the case. I don't feel safe because of other women. That's really weighing heavily on me, and there's no way any woman should feel. I want to get people thinking about how this narrative is affecting even the strongest members of our community. Normally, whenever we hear from Munroe, she's always attacking one group or another. So yeah, I'm going to call a bit of bullshit that you're one of the strongest members of our community. Trans people are always being told from inside the house that the world hates us, and this whole idea of there being a toxic narrative against trans people in the media, with it being worse than ever before, is absolutely ludicrous. If anything, we're living in a more sympathetic time than ever before. I'm not seeing stories of people saying the trannies are out to get you. Instead, what we're getting is an actual discussion from some parts of the media, whether it's the likes of the Times or the Telegraph. Hell, even the Guardian sometimes does this, and that's one of the wokest publications out there. And to make this out as though this is some sort of threat is very irresponsible, particularly from someone with such a privileged position as Munroe. The media is not out to get you. The media is out to get kids who wear MAGA hats. And I don't get what she's insinuating when she says she doesn't feel safe around other women. What do you think they're going to do to you, Munroe? In fact, I hate this whole idea of being able to give a sweeping statement against a group of people, and that's exactly what she's done here. And as I mentioned earlier, she has form for doing this. She just seems to say that group is bad, or at least it indicates at it. And that's a dog whistle if I ever heard one. Women are not going to randomly assault you in a bathroom. And maybe if we were living in a period of time where we saw gender-critical feminists roaming in gangs, going into bathrooms, demanding birth certificates and IDs to make sure the tranners weren't in there, maybe you might have a bit of a point. But none of this is going on. Hell, you look better than I do, and I've never had any problems with going into any kind of bathroom. I've never had to worry about whether I'm going to be assaulted by a woman. And yet you do. Despite the way that you look. You're saying this just for attention. Trans people have never had it any better, especially you. You've made a whole career out of this. But you have to be a victim again, don't you, Munroe? That's all you offer. Munroe did try to backtrack on these comments, however, saying, "Anyone who attended my talk at WOW Global would have heard me speak about the toxic media climate in the British press, largely perpetuated by TERFs, that is making trans people feel unsafe in public spaces, myself included. What I didn't say was I felt threatened by one of the women. Yes, the vast majority of TERFs are cis women, but many cis women are also allies to the trans community." But it's still kind of what you said, isn't it? I mean, you didn't specify a particular ideology that some of these people might have been following. You just said women. So yeah, I think it's actually quite fine that you're called out on that. Just like the way that you were called out when you said white people are the most violent force on earth. All you offer is controversy. And whilst I don't think you are the worst activist out there, I can certainly think of some more dangerous people You are highly irresponsible, and you do not speak for me. So what are your thoughts on the stories that I've covered today? Is there anything in particular I've missed off? Remember that the world of crazy trans news moves so fast, I'm always going to miss off one or two things. So please let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.